is what I think needs to be discussed much more, the fourth driver that I've not yet mentioned, and that's the global economic crisis that has hit Europe so hard. And this current economic crisis, it really needs the engagement of all of us working in public health to be a strong defender of the importance of keeping the public health. We have seen several slides in various sessions today about the prevention paradox and the damnation of prevention is that you don't see it when it works well, but with less investment it will be difficult. So my last slide, over the next century, the next coming years, it's clear that it's the economic and political factors that will be the major influence when it comes to infectious disease threats to public health, and much more than biology and ecology. So the challenge is to find sufficient funding and to support the politicians, get political commitments to have a continued investment in public health. And this is, of course, not only communicable diseases, but also non-communicable diseases. So we need to continue to invest Europe-wide and globally, surveillance, monitoring, identify actions that are needed to control, and pay much more attention to public health governance. So I think that a setting like this one, EUFA, is really splendid, where people with so many backgrounds, experiences could meet, because of these challenges, not least when it comes to the political and economic crisis, it really needs that we are working together across disciplines. And I really would like to see that this division between communicable diseases and non-communicable diseases, that we could try to get rid of that and try instead to work together and learn from each other and learn from people across borders and across professional experiences. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Ekdahl. With three plenary speakers hailing from very different backgrounds with very different interests, DG Agriculture, ECDC, St. George's University Hospital in London, we've had plenty of food for thought. I was struck, however, by certain commonalities. For example, the use of the word global, the global implications, transcending across the different areas of action. And I believe we may have just a few minutes for any questions or comments to our panel speakers. Yes, Professor Brandt.
Helmut Brandt, Maastricht University. A question to Professor Stachan. When I had the announcement of your talk, I thought that you would talk too about epigenomic effects, because that we see here now from in the public health literature, that might be the link between environmental threat and switching on and off genes. You didn't mention this. What is the reason for it?
One of the reasons is that I had limited time. The other reason is that I think epigenetics or epigenomics, if one adopts an approach which looks at multiple sites, this is looking at parts of the DNA sequence which have been inactivated through a variety of chemical reactions, typically methylation, but also one or two others. And these can now be tested for specifically. In essence, I see this as part of mechanism rather than part of cause. There was a lot of interest in the epidemiological life course research community about the possibility that epigenetic change might explain not only long-lasting effects from early life programming influences, but also potentially intergenerational effects. The emerging data that I've seen in the last few months suggests that the vast majority of this genetic inactivation or methylation change is actually something which is not heritable, it's acquired, it's not shared between siblings, it's not shared between identical twins and so forth. So my guess is that what we'll see is a lot of interest in epigenetic testing as a way of getting close to what is going on in specific tissues. But I would add that it's not quite as simple as some of the enthusiasts would say, because even circulating peripheral blood is a mixture of tissues. And unless one's prepared to separate out the different types of white cells, then what you're looking at when you test the DNA in circulating white blood cells is a mixture of effects on potentially very different tissues. And of course, it probably has very little to say about what's going on in the brain, in the lung, and the liver, and so on. So for those reasons, I personally don't get too excited about epigenomics, but I'm afraid the money is flowing in that direction, and we've seen what happens when a new technology comes along. There's a huge rush for the gate, and that's the rush that's on this year and next, I think.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions?
I'm Raj Bhopal from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. I think modern human beings are always hopeful that technologies are going to solve all their problems. But listening to these three presentations, I'm left with the opposite view. Technologies seem to be the cause of our problems rather than the solutions. If you take climate change, that's being caused by technologies. I wouldn't say that asthma is necessarily caused by technologies, but certainly some of it is, whether it's air pollution from motor vehicles or other causes. And our farming crisis, yes, probably that has also been caused by technologies, probably beneficial technologies that have raised life expectancy and reduced death in early life. So perhaps that's an example of technologies benefiting us but producing extra problems. So perhaps there might be a comment as to whether this holy grail that technology will solve all our problems is likely to happen within my remaining lifetime. I'd like to know the answer to that.
Let me, as an infectious disease doctor, give a much longer historic perspective, and I totally agree with you. I don't know how many has read the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, which really shows, I mean, in a broad range, the human history, how technology has been a driver of infectious diseases, and those civilizations that had less technology and were not exposed to animals, big cities, etc., they were really vulnerable, and this was part of a conquest of Latin America, etc. But it's also true today when we see the new infectious diseases like SARS, is really where human is expanding, not only through technology, but also expanding our life space, getting into ecological areas and niches where we have not been before. So it really is a dual sword.
Thank you. We can already know that you want to make a comment. Perhaps you can raise your hand because there's another microphone.
I'm Ioan Bocșan from Romania. I'm a little bit surprised the way these three talks consider technical factor having impact on epidemiological processes, because none of these are determining factors. Their influence could be positive or negative, but not determining. They are not cause. They are secondary factors. In infectious diseases, I should be horrified if I should go back to Pasteur's or Leeuwenhoek era, saying that modern technologies are endangering us. Probably, as you saw those green discs larger for TB in wealthier countries, probably they mirror just the capacity of diagnosis, a better surveillance, a better early detection of cases not direct influence between technologies and the risk of TB. So altogether, I shouldn't refuse the idea of having access to better technologies. The problem is to try keep your eyes on the whole picture of the problem, not only on one factor. As Rothman says, in medicine, most of the diseases are having causal factors unnecessary, and that's it, the problem. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe there was another comment down here at the front, so that we take any remaining questions and comments, and then I will ask our panel to come back and close the session with their concluding remarks.
Steinar Westin is my name. I'm from Trondheim, Norway. I'm a professor of social medicine, but also a general practitioner. And since we now have the, well, thank you first of all for the very interesting session this was. And I think now we have the opportunity to ask, when we have the agricultural sector and the infectious disease sector, there was one thing I was waiting to hear, and that was not only about the new emerging virus diseases, Nile disease and all these things, but also about the common old infections and antibiotic resistance. Since as a GP, I'm being told that you should weigh your milligrams carefully not to increase antimicrobial resistance. While my suspicion is that still in the EU, there's a good use of antibiotics in the veterinarian sector, in the agricultural sector, even as weight-inducing or factors in feeding animals. Is it still so? I'm really asking because the impression in Norway is it still goes on at a large extent using antibiotics in these wild ways in the agricultural sector. And what effect might it have on antimicrobial resistance in Europe?
Right. Anyone else? Okay. If not, then perhaps you may wish to respond to some of the final comments made, and let us have your feedback. Ms. Samitsi, would you like to start?
I think in terms of agricultural technologies, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, with some basic technology, you don't need to have like the latest technology, but adopting also local varieties, local conditions, taking into account local agroecological practices, tackling the issue of extension services, but doing this in a holistic dimension. I think we can see a lot of progress in agricultural production and productivity in sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, vis-a-vis Asia, still lags behind in terms of yields. And if we can address this with simple techniques, but having a bit of a strategic overview and positioning agriculture production in a more holistic economic strategy, I think we can see a lot of progress. Clearly, the area of animal diseases is something which needs to be tackled. In terms of trade, sanitary and phytosanitary issues are becoming more and more important. When we speak about global trade, it's less clearly about market access. It's more about non-tariff barriers and technical barriers to trade in terms of flows. And clearly, trade, the more we trade, the more there are certain opportunities, but also certain risks. And this will be clearly an area of major research in terms of looking more at technical barriers to trade and how to address these at a local level, especially in the most vulnerable countries.
Thank you. Professor Strachan?
Well, I think the title of the session was Getting Smart, was that right? And I think the smart thing is to use the right technology in the right way and not to use too much of it because money is in short supply at the best of times, and we're not in the best of times. So in terms of the investigations, I think we do need to be judicious about the use of new technologies. I think that if I could just make a brief comment about the other two presentations, I think the intriguing aspect is that in public health we almost have two tasks. One is to explain the burden of disease we see before us today, but the other is to try and predict what that burden is going to look like in in 2020 or 2040 as conditions change around us. And I mean, that second challenge is something which we need to address through judicious use of technology as well. So I think that the take-home message is that you need to be smart rather than just accept what the salesman will say about the latest technological advances. But I think I would agree with the comment that it's difficult to lay all of humans' miseries at the door of technology. Some technologies are good and some technologies are bad, and it's the right one in the right place at the right time which will lead to the maximum benefit.
Thank you. Professor Ekdahl.
I think that beautifully leads over to my concluding remark. I think antibiotic resistance is a very good example when we have not been smart with technology. I mean, science gave us this wonderful drug or drugs that revolutionized medicine in an extremely short time. And by naively relying that technology would keep on supplying us with new drugs and new drugs, we have, by ignorance, put ourselves in a situation where we now have almost nothing on the reserve. And I think today this is probably one of the biggest threats we have. And that means that in the short run, we need to go back to the founding fathers, Pasteur, but I think even more in Semmelweis, and go back to the basic issues of hygiene. But of course, we need also to put our hope on technology, that antibiotic was one chapter, and to hope now that completely new mechanism, looking more at the genetic, etc., would be the second generation that would take over after we have burnt out the traditional antibiotics.